Okay, are we live again? I wanted to jump on again quickly because while this is still fresh in my mind, I want to discuss a bit, even for my own self-reference for next week, what went wrong with my last stream because I've never had a stream like that before. I mean, I ramble, and discussing a theory of everything does branch you into all kinds of areas, but for the first time, it wasn't that I branched into a bunch of different topics. It was that I couldn't maintain coherence. And I realized during it what I had done, which was I had done exactly what I know is impossible to do, which is I was discussing a stream by Curt Jaimungal and Leo Gura, my thoughts on it. And my thoughts on it are that I agree with Leo, and I think that he's telling the truth on what he's saying. But then I tried to say, I don't want to say I guess I tried to say my differences. Because, why wouldn't you dissect, I guess, disagreements? But the problem is that if you're going to define thought process by being against that which is fundamentally true, like one of these structures or aspects that is intrinsic to sentience, that exists everywhere: consciousness, God, love, meaning, life, existence, all of these things, matter even, are actually a superposition always. They all exist in a superposition. They're all coins with a heads and a tails. And there is an order that you must follow in order to maintain coherence when discussing these topics, like the oneness and multiplicity problem, or the one and many problem. It's not a problem. It's just an intrinsic aspect of our reality. And an aspect of God from a certain perspective. But these topics I'm going to discuss much more next week. And my goal is to show that if I discuss them as this is what is true, as opposed to this is what is that, as opposed to this is true because that person's false, or that person is wrong about something that is intrinsically true, which cannot exist. Okay? You break down coherence. I will be able to even maintain coherence. I've not experienced this ever, and it is a good learning moment, but I'm going to make the stream from earlier tonight visible next week. Again, not till then though, because it is important that even that information be digested in order. You first have to see sense and then understand, nonsense. If you don't see sense, then you don't understand even if you're looking at nonsense, okay? And this is another one of these instances where there's structure that is, there's two sides of it. They seem to be codependent or mutually dependent, nonsense and sense. But you have to understand them and perceive them in order for you to even interpret them into that structure. Because if you look at something that makes no sense, and then you try and use that to deduce what is sense, you can't. And but if you look at what makes sense and then you look at something that is nonsense, you'll be like, that's nonsense because that's sense. But you can't go the other way. And my stream did exactly what I just said you can't do. And it's never happened before because every other stream that I've done, even though we discuss these topics all the time, whenever we are discussing someone else's interview, it's about someone else's theory. And for the first time with Leo, it wasn't about theory. It was about that which he knows. And so if I'm trying to show differences of that which is definitely true, but we might, I don't even want to say disagree, but that there might be a way of talking about it that is actually the objective direction to go down. That has to be focused on independently of being defined by someone else's statements of the truth. You need to define that process that is discussed of this is how you state the truth, this is what is true, and this is how you state it, and this is why you have to state it this way, has to be internally consistent. And if you're using exterior information inside of that process, you cause a decoherence. And there was I don't think I could have necessarily seen that coming last stream, just because I've never experienced it before. Because everything else is like, this is geometric unity. This is CTMU. This is my beliefs. But then if you're like, this guy says the truth, but let's try and show how he said it is wrong. Like, it doesn't work. It falls apart. And it's actually a great lesson because it proves exactly what I say all the time. Don't define yourself by a negative. Don't be anti-fascist, you'll become fascist. Don't be anti-racist, you'll become racist, because you can't maintain coherence. So what happens, and you basically become exactly what you're trying not to be. And it's the only way that stream of thought can actually manifest and actualize. So this is much more coherent, what I'm saying now, because it's not being defined by some exterior truth that is true. Okay? That is not just a true, a theory that is true, or, that some subjective experience is true. It's about something that is always true everywhere, in you, outside you, around you, through you, before you, after you. It's always true. Love, meaning, God, consciousness, matter, all of these things require order. A specific order. They're always two sides. God is one and he's infinite. But which one do you start from? How do you understand the world? Do you assume God is true and one, and that everything is God? Or do you assume that you exist and build from there and get to God exists and God is one? The latter is the truth. It's not even that it is the truth. It is the path. Okay? It is the path of sense. And if you think about the truth as like a park that you can't escape. It's like Central Park. And there's paths through it. But if you go off path, imagine that there's nowhere to go off path. Like, it's not like you can go hide in the bushes or something like that. It's just like there's only the path. But if you deviate from the path, what actually happens is you just spiral. You spin in place. But within relativity, you can't actually have staticness. So it devolves. It decays. It falls apart. It doesn't maintains staticness. It decoheres. So there is a specific order that is always required when discussing these things regarding meaning. And I'll use one example. It's like, what is love? And definition that I came up with years ago was that love is the gravity of consciousness, which means that gravity is the love of the universe, and that gravity is the ultimate animating force. This is true, but if we're going to talk about how do you come, you can't come here, so what I'll say, you cannot come to the determination that gravity is the love, aka animating action, or animating force that is an intentional action by the universe, if you start with gravity is the love of the universe. You have to start with that which you know is truer than anything else that you know, or that which you are more confident in it being true than anything else that you know. What is the truest thing that you know? It is that you exist. I am. It's not that God is, or the universe is, or anything like that, or that Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue, or whatever. It is that you are. And that must be assumed. And then you can build a sensible understanding from there. I got to gravity is the love of the universe by assuming its sentience, which you understand when you're thinking about, which you're able to relate to the statement of love is the gravity of consciousness. And if you don't think of the universe as consciousness, though, then you're lost. And also, if gravity is the love of the universe, it doesn't really help you understand you. Okay? There's nowhere to go. But if you're like, well, love, that I understand through my firsthand experience of interaction with my family, with my friends, with my romantic partners, whatever it is, as that which draws you together, then you can apply it up. But you can't apply it from the top down because you're not at the top. Okay? So that means that you're making an assumption out of context if you're starting from the top. You have to start from the bottom because you aren't at the top. You are not God's sovereign, even though you are a piece of God. And this is also apparent when you're thinking about what love is outside of that poetic definition that I gave, that is actually also super literal, true definition, is that what is love? Love is an action. Fundamentally and foremost, it is an action. And I was speaking to my wife after the stream about how just like the whole thing fell apart. And I was explaining what had happened, how things, I had basically set it up so that in what I was attempting to do in the stream was not allowing, it made it impossible for me to actually go in the correct order and continue doing what I was doing, which was not starting from what I know is to be true. And you have to do that when it comes to things like this and these topics that are, people would call them esoteric, but they're not esoteric, they're ever present. And when something's ever present, it's unfalsifiable, and it's also undifferentiated. It's not able to be differentiated from anything else. And because of that, the way in which you make sense of it is through a hierarchy of direction, but not through distinction, because there isn't distinction. There's nothing that isn't love. There's nothing that isn't, objectively. There's nothing that isn't, you can deduce what is subjectively not love, but you have to start from the understanding first that it is fundamentally an action and that is good, and then you can deduce emergently that there is actions that are not good and therefore are not love. But first you have to define, you have to not just define, deduce, realize that love is an action that is intentional, that has a good impact on another sentient being. So you can love another by bringing them food, taking care of them, whatever. Then there's this other side of love, which is where the feeling comes in, and that feeling is the feeling of being loved. Okay? But you can't start from love is a feeling of being loved, because you first have to realize that it is an action that you have done to you or that you do to others, and that is then felt. You don't feel it and then you act it. You have it acted upon you and then feel it, or you enact it upon someone else and then they feel it. This is so important. The way in which I was doing my stream caused it to go against this, and it fell apart. And I don't regret it. It was fascinating. I am going to make it able to be seen, but like I said, after, I'll think about it after this. Now that this kind of like explains what's going on, but it might wait till after next Tuesday where I actually start really showing like this pattern in more instances and more examples than just love, which is a good example, but it is that there is a hierarchy, which is a directionality. That's what a hierarchy is. And that these objective, ever-present truths of existence, properties of that which exists objectively, consciousness, sentience, feeling, matter, perspective, all these things are always two-sided. But that doesn't mean that those two sides don't have an order to how they must be understood. One comes first, then the next. And like I said before, the coin is the perfect example. Heads comes first. Tails cannot come first. Tails follows. Heads goes first. And this is a very important concept to understand when discussing all of these unfalsifiable, ever-present truths. So, wanted to basically just say that, and even just show now what can happen when you are internally consistent and defining, and then a stream of an idea or an information stream is defined by that which is assumed true or is true, not by the assumption that something that is definitely true no matter what is false. And I've discussed it here before. Philosophy PhDs once talked to me on my Discord, and they were doing a philosophy of consciousness, and they were getting their PhD in it. Doesn't make any sense at all, because they were making the argument that consciousness doesn't exist when they were studying it, for their career and their PhD, and they were writing a thesis stating that consciousness doesn't exist. Them as a conscious being were writing a thesis that consciousness doesn't exist. That type of decoherence is exactly what happened in my last stream. This lends a lot of credence to the truth of what Leo Gura was saying in Curt's discussion with him, because I don't think that there's anybody else that I've ever seen a discussion of and ever discussed a discussion of on this stream that led to decoherence. It wasn't the discussion of someone's theories. It wasn't the discussion of someone's models. It wasn't the discussion of someone's opinions. It was, he was saying what is true. And I'm saying there is a way of explaining the truth that is necessary to understand it, because you need context for understanding. There's no such thing as even information outside of context. Context is information. And context comes from understanding where things place is, like where your place is. That's the better way of putting it. Context comes from understanding where your place is. Not starting with understanding where God's place is, but starting with understanding your place, or understanding God's place in relation to you. It's not, it has to be in relation to you. Everything has to be in relation to you to have context that is tied to your firsthand experience, which means it's tied to your truth, what you know, not what you believe, not what you assume, not what you want, but what you know. And it's very important that you prioritize you as the starting block of anything. This leads to the definition of an understanding and perception of discreteness. To understand you is to also then understand what isn't you and how it relates to you. And then you build up from there. But you can't start from trying to understand something beyond you before you understand that it starts with you, instead of starting with something above you. You can't do that. And that was, that's just something I'm trying not to define this by and make the same mistake. I'm trying not to make the same mistake. It is just essential that this is known, or this is understood. You and your firsthand experience is the most reliable source of information that you have. And you can actually understand an enormous amount about reality, far more than almost anybody knows. You can understand the meaning of the creation of the universe. You literally can. You can deduce it. And know it. Literally know it. Not have a theory, know it. And that comes, though, from building logically and putting information in context. The context of you and how you relate to everything that you perceive. So, my final comments on I guess for now, the stream with Curt and Leo is, Leo does know what he says he knows. What he says is true. You can know way more about existence than people assume. And you do have to assume that it's possible to understand it if you ever are to be successful in your attempt to go on a journey to understand it. You have to assume that you can understand the meaning of the creation of the universe in order to understand the creation of the universe and the meaning of the creation of the universe. Once I had this epiphany years ago, and I was like, I think then I got a glimpse of like a tiny bit of very simple math, and of that would be the constraint that emerges from God creating a universe within himself, and that he would need to fit it. It would need to fit within him, which means that he would need to have more energy than is put into create left over for himself than he puts into creation, and that because he's one, it constrains you to like whole numbers, and that basically it inevitably ends up that he puts 1/3 of his energy into creation. And I just had this like flash once. I was like, I actually think it might be possible for me to deduce how God created the universe. And I tried it, and it worked. But if I had never assumed that that was possible, and I never would have tried, and if I never would have tried honestly, I never would have done it. So, you know, and it gave rise to it emergently gave rise to the properties of the Standard Model. When you look at spin and you look at charge, and then you look at the mathematical structure that emerges from this model that I made, and you look at the number of particles and the triality that is apparent and everything, and the duality that is apparent to those trialities. So, you know, you have the masculine quarks and the feminine quarks, as I call them. So up, charm, truth, down, strange, beauty. Then you also have, you know, electron, muon, tau, electron, neutrino, muon, neutrino, tau, neutrino. You start looking at this dual aspect to this triality, and you look at my model and you realize like that emerged naturally. But you can't do stuff like that unless you assume that it's possible. And right now we do assume that that's just beyond us. Always. What's the meaning of life? It's beyond us. But we can't help but, you know, continue talking about it forever. This is something that very few will ever overcome. But those that do, if they're able to maintain coherence, will be able to achieve amazing degree of understanding. And so, and here's another example real quick of like, is the universe deterministic, or is it that you have choice? And I've talked about this before, that they're actually mutually dependent aspects of reality. Okay, reality is the coin, existence is the coin, God is the coin, sentience is the coin. And sentience must have constraints. To have a self, you have to have a limit. You have to have internally consistent internal coherence of information. And that requires a limit, because otherwise it would just like, you know, information goes everywhere. It's not internally coherent. And you need that limit to provide that internal coherence. So, of mind. So it doesn't have to be like in your brain. I'm not talking about physicality. I'm talking about mentality. That's a constraint. In order to have choice, you have to have determinism, which comes from constraints. So in order to even have choice, you have to have constraints. And this is the order that I'm talking about. You can't say, do we have choice? Do we have free will? That's the wrong first question, or it's the wrong direction. You first have to say, we have constraints. What are the constraints? And then once you know the constraints, then you can understand what degrees of freedom you have. You can't understand what degrees of freedom you have and then understand the constraints. You understand the freedoms because you understand the constraints. You don't understand the constraints because you understand the freedoms. This is what I mean. There are two sides to a coin, but one is heads and one is tails, and one comes first and then the next. But at the same time, they are mutually dependent. So this is confusing to our minds, because how can something be mutually dependent and aka seemingly simultaneous, but also ordered? And the reality is that that which exists simultaneously must be understood in an ordered manner always still. So, you know, this is it's very difficult to understand this stuff because it's everywhere. It's not that it's so far away from you. You're a fish trying to understand where water is and what water is. It's not that you are, you know, I don't know, a camel trying to understand the jungle or something. I'm trying to think of like two things that are very, very far apart. But it's not that you're very, very far apart. It's that it's all around you. So distinctiveness, distinction, it's not how you go about understanding what is sentience. Okay, sentience is a self-aware, aka thinking being that feels. And then which one comes first, though, the feeling or the thinking? And once we spent all hours on the Discord, I feel like discussing this on the Discord calls that I have on Thursdays. And even though they are simultaneous, but your understanding of them is also like the movement of that information. It's not even that they are simultaneous. They are dependent. When one cannot exist without the other, but they have to go in an order. Just like understanding love. You cannot understand love if you understand it as an emotion. That doesn't mean it is, or as a feeling. It doesn't mean it isn't a feeling. It means that first you have to understand that it is an action in order to even understand when it is felt. Okay? And this is also true of understanding the quote unquote, not even distinctions, but yeah, distinctions between what is objectively true, what is subjectively true, what is consciousness, what is conscious, what isn't, what is perceived as conscious and what isn't, what is a sentient being, a singularity of sentience, versus what isn't. Order is the key to the context that is necessary to understand ever-present existence, which is sentient being. And that's what I'll leave it at. Peace. That was way more coherent, but I needed to do that while it's fresh in my mind, because if you watch the last stream and you watch this one, you can see there was a drastic difference, and it was because I actually followed the only path that there is this time, and I violated it last time. Thanks.